All right. Well, I think we should get started. Um, Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're coming from. My name is Tracy Wilson Rossman, Chief Marketing Officer for Chariot Solutions, and also founder of Journal My Health, which is a health tech startup. Thank you for joining us today to talk about a guide to cloud billing. I'm coming to you from my actual office in Fort Washington, Pennsylvania, where we're having a beautiful, beautiful week here. And by the way, go Phillies. Um, so gone are the days of software installed on physical computers. In the last 20 years, the majority of consumer and business software has shifted to the cloud. Instead of relying on the processing power of the computer in front of you, or even servers that your company owns, we now use the internet to allow Amazon, Microsoft, and Google's data centers to perform functions on our behalf, creating a seismic shift in the capacity of companies like yours to create and develop software, connect with customers and employees, and spend IT budgets. It should be of no surprise to anyone on this webinar that there's been a tremendous growth of cloud usage since the pandemic began. Businesses were already headed into the direction because of factors like shortening time to market and reduction of capital overhead. But with the need to distance ourselves from each other, many businesses discovered the need to distance technical staff from their data centers. Cloud has become almost ubiquitous. Many large enterprises have also recognized the value of cloud computing. In fact, around 87% of Fortune 500 companies have adopted at least one public cloud platform. With increased usage comes increased spending. By the end of 2022, US cloud spending reached over $90 billion, which was almost a 30% growth compared to 2021. By 2025, there will be an estimated 175 zettabytes, which I have even no idea how many zeros that is, of stored data on the cloud. And that's a 61% increase from 2021. AWS commanded 34% of the cloud market in 2022, with Azure in not a close second with 21% of the market, followed by Google Cloud with 10%, Alibaba with 5%, and IBM with 4%. But here's the stat that brings us here today. 7 out of 10 companies aren't sure what they spend their cloud budget on. So I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce my friend and fireside chat companion for the next 45 minutes, Claire Milligan. Claire is a founder of Aimably, and she has been working on understanding how to create spending with vendors like AWS and Azure and Google Cloud to help it seem more controllable. She founded Aimably to ensure all business leaders could harness cloud spending for financial transformation and ultimately business growth. Claire, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Tracy. And since Tracy is my friend, I would just like to say that she's an incredible chief marketing officer over at Chariot, and I was pleased to be able to get to know her as a founder as well, an entrepreneur as well. And she's also, she didn't say, but she's the founder of Tech Girls, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to inspiring teenage girls to consider careers in technology. So she's a multifaceted, phenomenal woman.
Now that we've had our little love fest over here, let's get down to business. Claire.
Yes.
Technical and financial teams are impacted by the growth of cloud services and cloud costs, but very few people in a company really understand how these cloud services are built. Let's just start with, let's talk about cloud billing and how it works.
Sure. So the major innovation from a financial standpoint with the cloud was that we are no longer owning things, we're renting them. And in renting them, think of it like the shortest of short-term rental you can imagine. We're not talking a lease at an office. We're talking about WeWork and the desk. So with that owning versus renting distinction, you then have to figure out how you're going to be billed for the use of these things. Also, they're virtual, right? So you're not actually saying, I would like to rent the specific server. You're renting the virtual capacity or functionality of that server, or a subset of servers, many more of them. So what happens is all of these vendors have started identifying various line items for billing. So it might be an hour, it might be the capacity, it might be the file storage, it might be all of these different things. And in fact, almost every service has 4 or 5 line items or SKUs that are going to get billed when you use that service. And based on your utilization of that service, it's going to hit those. The best metaphor I've come up with for this is to think of cloud services like a utility. So your meter gets checked for your water, right? You use your water for the month, your meter gets checked, and then you get the bill. It's the same thing with cloud services. Over the course of the month, your usage is tracked, and then at the end of the month, you get the bill. Oftentimes, the only way the finance folks will see that spending is at the end of the month, whereas engineering typically has a little bit more access. Because of that, you kind of, your water bill sometimes goes up some months and you're like, what was I doing? Oh yes, my kid decided to take these huge baths and refill every 5 minutes, which my kid actually does. And in California, we live in California, my goodness, the drought. But you discover it after the end of the month and then they confess, right? So the same thing can happen really easily in cloud billing. So not only is it what is happening, but actually it's hard to see exactly what the behaviors were that tied to that metering. When you look at the invoice, no matter the systems, you end up seeing the total spending by service. So that service might be virtual servers, which in AWS gets called EC2. It might be storage. It might be a whole bunch of things. But typically, a lot of those data points of the line items get rolled together and kind of summed up by that. Again, it's not helpful if you're not an engineer from that standpoint, but it does basically tell you the details of your metering. However, the one thing with cloud billing and the reason why it's really advantageous is because you don't have to worry about the maintenance complexity of those physical entities, right? You're only billing for, you don't have to worry about the pipes, you don't have to worry about the pump station, you don't have to have employees doing that. And similarly, you never have to plan for capital expenses, those cash outlays when you have to replace things and buy large components. So best way to think about it is metering, and remember you're renting these things and you can switch them up at any given time, should you want to.
Claire, one thing that you may not know is that my father used to be the person who would buy these large servers, and he was managing his own server, data server entity within his, I guess they were Fortune 500 at that point. So long ago, used to, and when he retired, I brought him to Chariot to show him like where our server farm was, and it was just like one rack, which is pretty amazing. And now we talk about like we don't even really have anything. So it's just changed so much in terms of how costs are. So I bring this up because there's such a change in how the financial and technical teams are looking at the costs. It used to be probably somewhat easy to look at this. But now they really need to have a better understanding because of this utility analogy that you've put out there. How can each side teach each other about their needs and the usage to help organizations optimize their spend?
Sure. I think sometimes it's really hard to know unless you sit down and ask the questions, because instead of asking the questions, here's what we usually hear. Budget time. You're looking at the P&L for the previous year, how much we've spent, and cloud is just spending way too much. Or maybe the crazy bill came through because of the overfilling of the bathtub, and finance is saying, look, we're just spending too much. We need to do something about it. And with all good intention, technical leaders say, okay, we're going to figure out how to spend less. Go back, they look into how their software is written. Most software people now are architects rather than infrastructure people. So they'll go in and say, where are we being inefficient? Where are we using things that we shouldn't be using? How have we taken advantage of infrastructure in a specific way? And the answer is almost always coming back from engineering. This is an architecture problem and we can solve it. We just need to rewrite a significant portion of our code, or we need to move to containers, or we need to do some or other more efficient usage of these resources. And finance says, great, when are you going to do it? Oh, well, you see, what's going to happen is we're going to have to stop our feature roadmap. And in the case of a software company, that would be stop the ability to sell new things, right? And turn and do this cost-cutting thing and use all of our engineering resources and their cost, right, to fix this cost thing. And then at the engineering table, and that's the engineering presentation, and the rest of the folks that are in the executive meeting go, oh, no, that's not what we were talking about. Okay, we're good, you know? And then finance walks away saying, tech is this black box. I don't get it, but it's very expensive and I won't touch it because it seems to be made of fire. And engineering is saying, they don't really know what they want. Like they want us to spend. They don't want us to spend. They want us to change. They don't want us to change. I don't know. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing, right? This vicious continuous cycle just keeps going. And it's become very dangerous now that the economy is shifting, because that works fine in a situation where costs can be okay and growing alongside revenues in software companies. And in enterprise businesses, stock prices are doing fine, and so extra costs are okay. It's understood. But really what we need to talk about is, what are these goals? What are each side trying to accomplish, separate from those odd conversations in this vicious cycle, right? The goal of a finance team is to model the future and to make sure that model fits the way the business is intended to operate. And that's especially true for a public company, because they need to be able to predict to the market and be able to meet or beat those expectations, right? So they can model anything. And in fact, when I was in my last position, I was in charge of a P&L for the subset of our business, and everything but the cloud I could model. If I needed to change things, I could say, like, okay, we can get rid of the lease, we can downsize, like we have these personnel, we can get rid of them, God forbid, but you know, that's something that we might have to do. I had all of these levers I could pull. Cloud, second biggest expense, no idea, right? So the idea is, how do I model? What are my options? What does this mean to me? And therefore, what changes can be made? That's the goal of finance, right? It may not be just like a baton saying you must spend less. That's just the expression of, we didn't meet our model. On technical teams, their goal is to build the future. And that's actually what Chariot does, right? So Chariot does a lot of custom software development, really smart architecture. They're phenomenal at coming up with really leading solutions that's like the opposite of outsourcing, right? And so these technical teams are building the future, and they want to do good work. And if you think about that triangle, what is it like when you're building a house? Fast, good, and cheap, right? There's a lot of pressure to also do it fast. So do you think it comes out cheap? No, right? You know, so like, let's be real. So the focus is on the highest quality, build the future, built to last, and also get it done so the business thrives. But with the right information, both of these things can change, right? The ability to model can be influenced by engineers assisting in that modeling process. And with the triangle of fast, good, and cheap, let's not make assumptions here. Let's work with with finance, and to figure out what are the priorities for our business right now, and how are we going to approach every project with the plans that are appropriate for our models, our future, our state of business, and all that.
So one of the things that we should be looking at is communication.
Yes.
Because each of them, you know, it's a different language, no pun intended here, but each of them has their own language, their own way of looking at things, and they can be scary to, you know, each side. So communication, teaching each other is one of the prescriptions that you're putting out there. I think that's great.
Yeah.
So many in our audience think about the cloud from the technical perspective. And as we just discussed, they may not be aware that there's this major financial change that happens when a company moves from on-premise or their own data center into the public cloud.
Yeah.
It's a shift from capital spending to operational spending. Let's talk about this. It's not exciting to talk about, but
so
it's
important.
kind of important for us to understand.
Yeah.
So let's break it down.
Okay, so let's talk about the owning versus renting. I'm going to go to cars this time. You buy a car, it has a price, and you can resell it, but it's depreciated in value, right? So the longer you have it, the less you can resell it for, but it's still an asset. You own this thing, and it could become valuable to you in the form of cash should you need to. Let's say you lease a car. Okay, you're spending a regular amount every month. You did not have to pay a whole bunch up front for that car. We're going to ignore financing for a hot second here, though. But so you have to regularly pay for it, but you're never getting anything back. You can't sell the thing. You have to return it. All you're getting is the forgiveness of having to pay for that again. Then let's talk about renting a car. You can rent one for an hour. You can rent it for 2 hours. You could rent it for a month. But if you added all those hours together, that's far more expensive than a lease. Okay, so think of that as you own your own servers, or you have space in a colo data center that you rent, you lease, or you're using the public cloud. So like that's your own, your lease, your rent. Okay. When you rent, you absolutely do not have any ability to recoup any money back, but you're also not on the hook for the cost per month. You're on the cost per hour. It's the same thing with the public cloud here, right? Okay. So when you buy an asset while you put out a whole lot of cash, you're actually adding value to your business because that is asset value that could be resold. That's called a capital expense. You don't even see it on a profit and loss statement or an income statement. It doesn't affect your profitability at the time of purchase because it's a purchase of something with value. Then over time, it depreciates, it loses its value, right? And so the cost of that depreciation comes through in your expenses. So that like it kind of comes over time, even though you put a lot of cash up front. If you rent, if you're all the way over in the public cloud, you are putting out expense the whole time. So every single bit that you're on the meter building is expense, and it's going to hit your profitability. So from 1 month to the next, you had an expensive month where you accidentally left Redshift running for way too long. That's affecting your business's profitability in that month. And that's a lot different than planning ahead of time and buying those things that have value. The thing is, cash and expense are not the same. And I'm using these terms as if you guys know them. And so you probably do, but let's just get into it a little bit more. Cash is the stuff it takes to buy things. That doesn't mean that that is the expense to the business at that point in time. It might have lasting expense effects. So you buy a license to a big software package that helps run your customer support team and you pay for it annually. The expense is actually divided across the entire time that you use the software. It's cash upfront, expense divided across, right? So a capital expense, cash upfront, depreciation expense across the time, public cloud, more expense and across the time with no cash upfront and no asset value to resell. It gets more complicated when you're talking about a company that sells its software. So that's not just operational expense. Every business has two types of income statement expense. One is the cost of goods sold, also known as the cost of revenue, and the other is operational expense. The theory behind this is I can sell my widget, and there's a cost to build that widget and to produce that widget so that that widget has value to you. And then there's the cost to buy paper, pens, and keep our office running. If all of that went away, the paper, pens, in our office went away, I would still be able to produce and sell the widget to you. That tells the public markets, okay, this business has a fundamental profitability on that gross margin, and then everything else can be played with. We can choose not to have an office. We can choose not to buy printer paper. That kind of thing, okay? When it comes to the public cloud, half of it is operational expense because you're building new software. You're not servicing current customers. You're running, customer support environments. You're running data analysis, right? And then the other part is your production environment, and that's cost of goods sold. Because if you did not have your production environment running, you would not be able to have a customer using your software. That is an expense that's so important to every business in terms of thinking its value, because you say, what are your margins on that cost of goods sold? And that indicates the overall value of your business. So if you're in a data center, you have 0 of that hitting your cost of goods sold. And if you're in the public cloud, you probably have 75% of your cloud bill hitting that area of your P&L. So it completely changes the math on the valuation of a company and puts you in a different category. A cloud-based software business in the public markets is valued differently from one that's in a data center because of those structural differences. And so if you're doing a migration, you absolutely have to plan for this kind of stuff. I know it's a little bit deep in the finance world, but that's where we are.
Well, and that's why we need to have these conversations, especially for the technical folks who aren't always, in the weeds with the finance folks. So we're going to do one more financy question. Really, what are the questions that the finance leaders are trying to answer when they're building these financial models with a cloud spend?
Yeah. So, they're building the model, right? It's not that they necessarily want to put the finger on the model. They just want to build it and make sure it works and then start playing around with you and partner with you on that. There's some key KPIs that they always have to track against. And depending on your line of business and your industry, there's going to be a wide variety. And you're going to see like 20 of them reported on the Wall Street. But think about 3 things: growth, overall profit, and then margin, which is that subset, that's the margin on the top of profitability before you've got your paper pencils and office supplies. Those things need to be steady or growing in order for a business to really look healthy. And you can sacrifice one for the other a little bit. You've got some play in there, but you can't just say, oh, they're all going down, that's our plan. So those are the things that matter the most. But once you've got your plan, the other thing they have to think about is cash planning. And for many businesses, they are servicing expenses like loans and like heavily committed leases. So they know their cash going out the door to those things, and they know it's coming. And so a surprise bill over here that's due in like 10 days, because that's what can happen with AWS bills. That thing is scary because it's unpredictable. They don't know it's coming. And so it's a very big concern. So they're trying to answer, what is our cash planning going to look like for each of the next upcoming months, and to try to give some predictability to that. The other thing is, like, let's go super deep, and let's say like your cloud spending is so under control, everything's great, you're beating all the benchmarks, everything's great. Well, then a finance team needs to think about, what is the cost of each subset of our business? Like, is this product line profitable, or is that product line profitable? Is one driving the other one? Is it actually hidden that we've got this cash cow and then this other one that's just like spending money out the back door? Because at this time when economics are really unpredictable, investment and divestment are really important decisions. That means, are we going to put more engineers over to this one product that is selling so well, and if we just added this one feature, it would just sell like hotcakes? And is this other product just tearing us down? And do we need to get rid of it? So when you're talking about a financial model, there's like the high end, like, is our business succeeding? Are we able to pay for things? But then, are we asking the right decisions about our suite of software or our lines of business that we're serving? Do we need, or even for like, let's say like a manufacturing example, is it just so expensive to run this plant that we need to then outsource it and have a fixed cost that we will pay to the other operator of this plant? That kind of questioning needs to happen right now.
Before I ask the next question, if you have questions, I know Becca had put in the chat, please feel free to throw some questions, as you're thinking about them, and we'll answer them at the end.
Yeah.
So we want finance and technology managers and teams to more than coexist, maybe even be friends.
Yeah.
So how can a technical manager, help the finance team accomplish their goals, which could in the end make their life a little bit easier?
Oh, absolutely. Also help manage their teams a lot easier. Let's start, it goes back to that original communication piece.
Yep.
Let's please don't assume anything about what other people want, right? Understand that from year to year, from month to month, and from day to day, sometimes priorities change. So always check in. Don't assume that because Claire told you that they're trying to build their margin, that that's actually what they're trying to do. So go into every conversation with the finance team to learn what their goals are, not just what they're asking you, to try to figure out why they're asking you for what they're doing and how you can better partner with them to get to an even better place for your business. One of the key areas to think about as a technical leader is that we often commit to things in order to get discounts. And when I say I commit to things, I'm talking about reserved instances, savings plans, commitments on Google get a different name. They're like pre-planned commitments. Overall enterprise agreements that give you a discount across the board. All of those things you get in exchange for a discount, a commitment to be spending at a certain level. And in some cases, for even a better discount, you're paying up front. Guess what that paying up front is? It's cash. We were talking about cash in just a second. So do not make any of those commitments until you talk it fully through with the finance team and everyone understands the implications of these things, right? Because what happens is often, hey, technical team, we need to save money. Great, cool, I bought all these RIs. Hey, technical team, how come you've got all these things on the bill that you're not using, that you're paying for, that we're paying for? Oh, because we needed to save money. Well, we're not actually saving money right now because things changed and it didn't work and now we're committed. So plan together and do not assume that what they told you last month is the same thing for this month. Next, it is essential for any business that sells their software to delineate clearly production and non-production expense, and do not mix these things, right? If you have R&D workloads running in a production environment, you must separate them in some way for your financial reporting. Otherwise, the business looks like it's unhealthy in comparison to what it actually is. Vice versa is true as well. If you've got an alpha server that's also servicing some kind of like product for the production, it's doing some extra workload on the side, you're falsifying, right, your financials position as a business. And what you don't realize is that failure to clearly delineate from finance is actually creating true errors in financial reporting, which for public businesses means that your finance team is legally culpable for this, right? So it's very important that you do that clear delineation. But even better is full allocations, meaning any kind of line of business for which you report revenue, you should report cost associated with that revenue. So if you have somebody buy module A and not module B, you should be able to separate between module A and module B in your reporting of spend. Similarly, cost centers. So, on the enterprise side, whether or not it's the manufacturing sites or whether or not it's different divisions or office buildings and all the IT that's running behind those things. Anything where it's a known cost center, keep it separate, divide it out, because that way the financial teams can model appropriately and are doing so accurately. Finally, well, I'm going to get to a final bit in just a second, but it's really important to also think about whether or not you're reporting from a cash or accrual standpoint. When I was talking about buying something up front and then the cost is actually the expense runs throughout the year, the expense running throughout the year, that's called accrual accounting. And when the cash went out the door, that's called cash accounting. You must use accrual accounting at a certain level of business. And that's like once you have it's called generalized accounting practices, GAAP, generally acceptable accounting practices. So when you get your AWS or Azure or GCP bill, that is a cash bill. And inside of it, you might have a pre-purchased reserve instance that actually lasts 3 years. that has to be accrued out. So you have to be able to show to a team that it's not just in this bill, this 1 month spend, but appropriately accrue those things for the period of time for which they're expended. And finally, it's just all about cost optimization, because at the end of the day, let's say you have a ton of spending on AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. This modeling is so important. The less you're spending, the less proportion of a business expense there is, and the less this becomes like critical, and an error is less impactful to the business overall, the less spending you have.
So now we're going to move a little bit more over something that the technical team can have a little control over, since we've been so deep in the weeds on the finance side. This cost optimization piece, this is the place where technical team has control. Talk to me about some of the typical issues that can cause those extra costs where they really shouldn't be. You know, it's not a good spend. It's not a good way for them to spend their budget.
Sure. So we like to categorize our customers and really the folks in the cloud overall into 3 buckets, and the issues that address each of those buckets are quite different. The first is like migrated. So you had a whole system that was running on servers that you owned or that you leased, and you migrated them exactly as they were functioning to the cloud. We kind of talk about that sometimes as like running on bare metal. You just provision a server as if it were something you owned, and you run it exactly that way. Then what we have is what we call legacy, which is it was architected for the cloud before a lot of these managed services came around that solve a lot of the infrastructure headaches for you. So it'll use a database as a database and a server as a server, but it may not be taking advantage of something like batch processing to be able to move things from one to the other. Instead, they'll have a server running all the time to do that. And then the third is what we call cloud forward. So they're taking advantage of all of the managed services in order to be able to do all of their workloads. So let's talk about migrated and legacy. In those cases, I always use the car metaphor. I love cars, I'm sorry. So you don't use an F1 car to commute to work. So why? Oh, but you might drive 90 miles an hour if the freeway is open and free and clear, and wouldn't it be fun when you have that to have a really high performing car, but you still don't take an F1 car, right? So you have to think about the efficient use of hardware capabilities. Do not say, hey, you know what? We really don't want it to fail at that one point in time when we get a lot of load. So let's get that really sweet server. We know it's going to be great. No one would do that, okay? So you have to balance the ideal state against the efficient use of hardware capabilities. And so that's really taking it down and saying, what do we really need? And is this the right one? Similarly, you don't need a really high-end server to do a database. You need a database to run a database, these kinds of things. So you need to adopt a cloud forward mindset, even if you're not re-architecting. And that means pay only for the resources that your current load requires. If you are in traffic and you're moving at 5 miles an hour, you need less power. In fact, in my hybrid car, I force it to be only in battery. You go into this level that's appropriate. And as you need more capability for the load, then you scale. Okay, so you need to take these capabilities and scale them out in response to your workload and scale them back when you don't. In the case of these truly migrated bare metal situations, you do have to re-architect in order to take advantage of some of these things. So basically you can just like scale back the things you don't need, but you do need to migrate things a little bit in order to be able to scale up and scale down. Because scaling up and scaling down is really the answer to all of these questions. And over time, all of these cloud service providers have built in that capacity to almost every single one of their services. And if they haven't built it, you can code it, because you can go in and say, check on the utilization of this one thing. If it's going above this thing, provision another. It's very easy for you to do in code. So you do have to re-architect, but there is some short-term spending in order to get maximum long-term savings. So it's configuration-driven spending that's your ability to do work at the edges. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of that auto-scaling component, as well as other aspects. My favorite example is Aurora databases. They have 3 different ways to do backups. One of them costs 10 times the other one, and then the other one's in between. They don't tell you that. They're just like, do you want a backup where you can restore to the exact second 20 days ago? And you're like, yeah, I love that. No, it's expensive. Don't do it. So things like that. There's a whole lot of configuration, and we on average see about 20% savings just configuration driven. Once you're optimized, once you've had professionals inside your business or outside your business like us come in and validate all of that, then sign contracts. Don't sign a contract beforehand, because if you sign a contract, even buying a reserved instance, and then you realize you need to change, you're stuck. So even though it's the easiest thing to do it last.
Cool. I did see that we got a question, but I think we're gonna hold off
Yeah, I'll get it at the end.
to it at the end. So sometimes you wind up buying something that you thought you needed and then you don't, causing some cost overruns. There's tooling you had mentioned in that last section. What are some things that can be put into place to keep costs under control going forward?
Sure. I kind of break this into 3 components. One is identification that there's actually an issue, and it might be that there's not, possibly, and it's just that you've brought on a ton of customers and therefore your spending is going up. So there's identification, validation, you really have a problem. Then there's fixing it, but then there's third, which is reinforcing the fix and making sure it doesn't happen again. So let's talk about identification. I like to break it into people, processes, and systems, because you can't just buy software and not know what's going on. You can't just implement a process and not have anything to back it up. So people, you need somebody that's efficient at reviewing data, and specifically data related to finances and technical pieces. There's a discipline called FinOps. There's some incredible people. I actually noticed one of the people on here is somebody I know in FinOps. His name is John McGuire. So that's pretty cool. So it's the discipline of merging financial data and technical data to understanding. You can hire FinOps people. You can contract with FinOps experts. Either way, you want people that understand FinOps to do this. The process is a comprehensive cost, usage, and utilization analysis. So that takes all your line items of everything you spent on and then looked at, okay, so this cost for this server, how much % utilization was that server for this period of time, you know? And do we have extra space over here that we could cut down that would then reduce this cost? That kind of analysis. Additionally, what we do, I haven't seen other people do it, but I'm sure there are, is we run comparative cost runs against different configuration options. So we'll say, okay, and you can do this internally too, if you've got FinOps expertise. We say, okay, this configuration, let's rerun all our usage and utilization data and figure out what the cost would have been in that configuration instead of the one that we have here. And then that pre-plans and analyzes all the ways that we should change our configurations. The system you use to do this is you need detailed billing data. In AWS, that's called the cost and usage report, the CUR. In Azure, that's called Azure usage and costs. In GCP, it's called detailed billing. All of these things have deep line item information that the invoice does not. And then you need a big data analysis tool. You can use one like ours. You can use Athena. You can use BigQuery. You can use anything that you want to use. But at any rate, you need to be able to tie back to specific resources and their utilization, and then the costs that you're incurring. When it's about fixing, you need to find the fix, make the fix, and make sure it doesn't happen again. So that means like governance policies. Let's say that you've decided that one of the ways you can save a significant amount of money is to upgrade every single server to the latest version, which is usually about 20% cheaper. Super cool, takes a little bit of work. But should you allow any engineer to provision a server that's not that kind in the future? Right? So you need to write that policy to make sure that your environment now prevents that issue from happening in the future. That also means team assignment of responsibilities. That also means getting space in the roadmap to actually do those fixes from time to time. I'm not talking the re-architecture, I'm talking about the configuration changes. And then I believe in incentives. So if my engineering team has been incentivized on fast and good out of that triangle for forever, then you have to incentivize cheap somehow to get people out of that mindset, because they might just not believe you that this is really worth their time. So what we do oftentimes in our engagements is we say, here's the value of what we've saved. I want you, or what we think will save you. I want you to carve out that piece over there and set it aside in escrow and assign it and award it to the engineers who get you those results fast. And you'll see it just comes through so fast. When you reinforce, it's about budget ownership. It's about budget ownership at the engineering team level. So if you're saying, I know the exact expense of module A versus module B, there's a team that takes care of module A and a team that takes care of module B. So assign that budget there, make them plan for what's going to happen and roll that budget up. And treat cost overruns like production fires. Like, we wake people up in the middle of the night when a server goes down. Wake somebody up in the middle of the night when the server starts costing 2 times what it was supposed to be, because they're the exact same impact to the business.
So I'm going to go to the questions that we have in chat. I know that we didn't talk about, if you are looking at multi-cloud, or you're doing any analysis of private versus public in a hybrid way, that may be next time. So but if anyone has any questions, feel free. So I'm going to start with Steve's question, which was, how does a finance person learn what is considered efficient when speaking to a dev or ops person who says, we really, in caps, need this?
Data, Steve, data. It's not a binary question, actually, meaning, do I need the server or not? You probably do. The server's doing work. It's, do I need it configured this way? Do I need it operated 24/7? Do I need it to be steadily at this large size? Can it go down or not? And so the first question to ask as a finance person is to say, can we look at the utilization data together? Meaning, can we look and see what its CPU processing has been, what its IO processing has been? You don't have to know what those words mean, but you can look at percentages and use your very smart finance brain to say, look, there's always this 50% gap at the top. We're never using over 50%. So it's no longer, do I really need this expensive server? But rather it becomes, okay, let's cut the size of the server in half. What if it's not utilized overnight? Let's shut it off overnight. Or let's scale it up and scale it down in response to workloads, in order to be able to efficiently use everything rather than question whether or not we should have it in the first place. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, that seems like a more productive conversation.
Well, yeah, and then they get to show you everything they've got, like they have all the access to this information. It also spurs lots of great ideas. Once they're saying, oh, now I can really look at it from this perspective, I can evaluate other things and I can go in and do that. And wouldn't it be great if you said, and by the way, if you have this effect in this bill, I'll pay you some of the difference of what you saved. They're going to look at every single one of those charts, right?
Or at least not bother you about overruns. So Anthony has asked, what are best practices for gathering detailed billing data for workloads that are containerized or otherwise more granular than a billing line item? How much work would you expect is required of the tech side to accomplish this?
Okay, so we're going to go a little nerdy here. The majority of cost allocation work before containers came around was relegated to this concept of tags. And I have my own hill to die on about tags, but they are what they are. So the way tags work is it's basically a key and a value pair. So like, think about it like the red post-it or the yellow post-it would be the key, and then what you write on it would be the value. So like, it might be, you might use yellow post-its for products, and then you write out all the different products on them. And then every single resource in your environment is required then to have a tag on it that says what product it does. Or it might be split for some reason, but you can set a rule on that. That way, then you can look at the detailed billing data, break it out by the tagging, and understand what product cost what. It got really confusing when we moved to containers, because essentially you have subset processes in these little shipping containers all lined up on top of one server. And then the server itself has cost, right? So you have to think about, like, what did one job take over the capacity of the server for this period of time or not? And there's components that are also really important because there's also space on that server, and who's responsible for that extra space, right? So it gets complicated. The answer to that, the short answer, is namespaces, which are the equivalent of tags. And so you can see how much namespace takeover exists on the server, but that's a separate analysis traditionally from the detailed billing data analysis. What we recommend is, honestly, there are some separate tools out there. Unless you're using Fairgate on our Fargate, I forget how to say it, on AWS, because they have really good allocation built into that. That's awesome. So if you're thinking about it, go there, it's good allocation. But Cube Cost is one of them. It's one of the leading ones. And I recommend, I think there's Kibo is another. There are a few of them out there that then take your namespace data and their utilization on those servers and translate that down into data that will be able to be consumed with tagging information. So you can actually look at the utilization within those containers. And by the way, this is a very important question, even though it feels super nerdy, because the way that you take a migrated workload that's running on what I call bare metal and you make it scalable is you take each of those server functions, you containerize them, and then you shove them together in containers on shared servers that then scale. And that's the way you get auto scaling without having to deeply rewrite your code. So this is, the more enterprise you go, the more legacy you go, the more critical this question is.
So, I think just to close, first, if you have any other questions that maybe you think about post, please feel free to reach out. We're going to be sending out the recorded video so you can review. If you have any questions, just send that out, send that over. These coming into 2024, we're in an interesting time with the economy, with business, and with technology changing so quickly. Managing costs is really important, but how do we use the technology that we have to help manage those costs while continuing to help us innovate and do our jobs? So the other thing that I'll just put out there is, before we close up, is if you have an idea, if there's something that we missed that's really beyond just a little question, let us know. We can spin up a webinar pretty quickly.
Yeah, I'd be happy to help out.
So Claire, thanks for your time. This was really, really very informative. And I hope that our audience also was able to get some good takeaways from, what we talked about today.
Yeah, thank you too. It was a pleasure.
And everyone, thanks for joining us today.
Take care.
Bye.